and welcome back to the channel. Cyborg movies. I thought I'd do 3 Cyborg movies for this episode, basically because I've been watching them. And I got myself a new 4K TV and 4K Blu-ray player. And so one of the movies that I picked up was a 4K Blu-ray. So I thought, might as well use them and might as well watch some other movies and kind of roll them all in together, which is what I did. By the way, if you haven't been here before, thanks for dropping in. And if you enjoy the video, please consider liking, subscribing and leaving a comment. So I was going to do these in reverse chronological order, but I decided not to. So I'm going to start with the dim, dark, far-off days of 1973 with a TV pilot episode movie, which went on to make a very successful television series, but for me at least, the pilot episode is better than the TV series, and it is the $6 Million Man pilot episode. Lee Majors stars as Colonel Steve Austin, a former astronaut who went to the moon, and who is in a very bad accident testing out a NASA lifting body, which was one of the precursors for the space shuttle program. Steve loses an eye, he loses an arm and both legs, and a mysterious government organization decides to rebuild him and use him as a secret agent. Now, that's the basic bottom line of it, but it's a lot more complex than that in the pilot. It was based on a novel by Martin Caidin called Cyborg, and pretty much Steve Austin's the first big media cyborg that we have. There were previous movies where little bits and pieces of people were replaced by various mechanical parts. Of course, there was Kenneth Mars in Young Frankenstein a year later. There was also a really weird Euro-spy movie called Spy in My Eye, where a secret agent, played I think by Dana Andrews, had a camera implanted where his eye should be. But apart from that, this is the first big kind of media hit with cyborgs. The reason this one's a bit different is it takes the premise seriously. You see Steve Austin before the crash. He's out in the desert where the testing site is. He's walking out in the desert and kind of taking things nice and easy. He's not particularly respectful of authority. But he gets in, he does the job, and then crashes. And Dr. Rudy Wells, played in this case by Martin Balsam, who only 8 years before won a Best Supporting Actor Oscar. Wells is a friend of Steve Austin's, and he also has the technology to rebuild him with the little atomic motors in the arm and the leg, and the technology to replace his eye. Now, in the pilot, the eye doesn't have all of the marvelous things it has in the TV series. It doesn't do telescopic vision or anything like that. It's just purely an ocular replacement. And that's kind of okay. You don't want to cram too much into the pilot. So Steve wakes up from the crash. He has a beautiful nurse played by Barbara Anderson, with whom he develops a kind of relationship as he's in convalescence. So he wakes up, he's obviously in quite a bad way. And the leader of the mysterious organization, a guy called Mr. Spencer, played by Darren McGavin, around the same time he was playing Carl Kolchak, tells him that they're going to do what they're going to do, and Rudy Wells as well talks him through the technology. It takes months and months for him to become a $6 Million Man. The convalescence and the therapy is quite extensive, and the movie takes time to linger on that, and it goes to some very dark places as well. There's a scene just after he wakes up where he actively tries to disconnect his life support systems and commit suicide. And for an American TV movie of the time to have a protagonist do that, and somebody who went on to be one of the great TV heroes of the 1970s, it's quite a dark place. But Lee Majors is better than we expect him to be playing the role. He kind of essays the deep depression the character goes into, and the kind of anger and rejection of the implants that he, psychologically at least, experiences before he kind of thinks it through and kind of works it out and decides that he's going to give himself a chance to have a new life after this terrible accident. And all of that is played out really well. It works as a psychological drama. The character of Spencer, played by Darren McGavin, is really dark and just doesn't care about Steve Austin as a human being. He's an intelligent asset to this guy. And the interesting thing that they play with this character, which gives you a little bit of subtext if you want to look into it, is Mr. Spencer has a bad leg. He may even have an amputated leg, we don't know, and walks around with a cane and a pretty profound limp. So he's somebody with a disability who is using another person with a disability as purely an intelligence asset. And that makes it for me really interesting. It's darker and kind of more realistic than the series itself, which it just blew my mind the first time I saw it a few years ago. Now, the weakest part of this pilot episode is when he goes on a mission. He's got to rescue an Israeli diplomat who is kidnapped by Arabs in a secret base in the Arabian Peninsula. The implication is that it's either Saudis or Palestinians doing that. And so they go out into the California desert and they do some action scenes where he drops grenades into a tank and throws grenades at other people and gets captured by the baddies and then breaks free of his chains and drop kicks the door of his cell open and takes down all of the terrorists and then flies away to freedom in a DC-3 with the diplomat. And that really is the weakest part of it. The action scenes aren't particularly well done in any way at all. Some of the stunt work's okay, people tumbling down the sand dunes and all of that kind of stuff, but the action pacing and the action choreography is laughably bad in this. And for my money, it lets down the rest of the movie. Nonetheless, it went on to become an incredibly popular TV series, and then of course you had the Bionic Woman with Lindsay Wagner. You had Steve Austin going up against all sorts of menaces, including Bigfoot. Yeah, but for me, the pilot is the perfect point of that particular franchise, because it really does take the premise seriously and take the source material seriously, which is something that 1970s television very often didn't do. And it just works, and I think that if you can find it, and it is around, you're going to enjoy the pilot episode, because you can see the potential and the possibility of the road not taken in it being a much more serious franchise than it ended up becoming. The second one I've got for you is from 1991, so we're jumping ahead almost 20 years, and doing a kind of very much a B picture based on a manga and anime, but it's an American movie with American actors, American directors, and American special effects work. It's one that I saw in VHS days and liked, and I actually saw the anime, which was on TV for some reason at the time, before I ever saw the live action version. The anime was called Guyver Bio-Boosted Armor, and the movie is called The Guyver. It was directed by and created by a couple of guys who were mostly known for their physical special effects work. A guy called Screaming Mad George, and I'm not kidding there, and his co-pilot was a guy called Steve Wang. Both of them knew physical special effects, and both of them loved the Guyver franchise. So they decided to make a movie of it. Now, this is 1991, so it's not going to have any computer effects in it. They're all practical effects, and they ended up making about 50 different monster prostheses to put across quite a complex concept. In the movie, you've got a guy called Jack Armstrong playing Sean, a kind of martial artist who is not very good at it particularly. He's kind of a second-rate martial artist. He lives in the mean streets of Los Angeles, which are very generic. And he gets involved with a beautiful woman, played by Vivian Wu, whose uncle has created or discovered, it's a little kind of vague on those things, a thing called the Guyver unit, which is a kind of round, slimy looking object which is basically an organic version of Iron Man armor. Let's just keep it simple. Meanwhile, a group of aliens called the Zoanoids, who have been on Earth looking for the Guyver unit, because the Guyver, when matched up with a human being, is the only thing that can defeat Zoanoids, are hunting down whoever has the Guyver unit, in this case Sean, and want to take it back from him. Now, the interesting thing here is the aliens are played by really interesting cult movie actors. You've got David Gale, who of course was the disembodied head in Reanimator, playing the head of the Kronos Corporation, who's actually a Zoanoid. You've got the wonderful Michael Berryman from, among other things, The Hills Have Eyes, playing one of the aliens. You've got Spice Williams, a very jacked looking woman, playing another one of them. And Jimmy Walker, who people remember in the 1970s from Good Times, playing yet another one of the aliens. A CIA agent is also on the trail of whoever has got the Guyver unit and whatever's killing the scientists and other people around. And that CIA agent, who's very atypical, he's got a cop mustache and he's got a kind of attitude and greased back hair, is played by Mark Hamill, who did movies in the 1970s like Corvette Summer. And so Mark Hamill's in there playing the cop, and it's very much the kind of dip in his career. So the Zoanoids, who look like humans most of the time, can mutate into the Zoanoids. Meanwhile, Sean gets the Guyver unit attached to him, and it ends up being bonded to his body through a couple of nipples in the back of his neck, and it emerges from those nipples in the back of his neck and envelops his body, and to create the Guyver, which is a really nice piece of design. It's got a kind of backward horn on its head. It's got really sharp bone spears that come out of its elbows. It's got a really nice alien look, including extra eyes that sit there and run along little tracks so that he can see 360 degrees. It's just a lovely piece of design based on the original anime. Now, this movie is not great. It's a VHS era schlocky movie, but it's got something. It's a lot of fun, and it really commits to its premise, and the physical makeup effects are really good for the time. They really did do a wonderful job of making the monster suits and things look, if not realistic, then plausible. Some of them are more comical than others, but there are some really great monster suits in this one, and they have that kind of slimy, scaly 1990s look about them. The movie isn't to be taken seriously at all. It's a lot of fun, and it also generated a sequel. Never really went anywhere as an intellectual property, but the other thing I'm going to mention, I'm going to do a slight spoiler here because you've got to see this movie, is Mark Hamill's character gets captured by the bad guys and put into a laboratory tank. He escapes from it and turns into a giant humanoid cockroach. So if you want to see a movie where Mark Hamill turns into a cockroach in a very, very Kafkaesque kind of way, this is the movie for you. Now, I picked it up from Zavi.com. It's an Arrow Video version of it, and I like that. I like the fact that Arrow Video is doing things like putting out on Blu-ray a movie as deep cut and cultish as The Guyver. Now, it's not going to be for everybody. It's not going to be something that a lot of people are going to go out and seek. But if you're in the mood for that kind of thing, it's a lot of fun. And it is very nostalgic for that time 30 years ago, when people went down on Saturday nights and tried to borrow 10 movies for $10 at the local video store, and picked up just pretty much anything that was still on the shelves on a Saturday night and ran with it. And The Guyver is that kind of movie. Like I said, not perfect. It's got a very synthy 1990s score about it. It's got over-the-top villains. It's got underwritten characters for the protagonists. But the special effects work in here is much better than you could expect from most movies of the time. And in a really nice 2K restoration of this, the makeup effects look good. Now, I only previously saw them on VHS quality, and they looked okay on that. But seeing them in a lot more detail on the big screen, and with a much higher resolution, they still stand up, and it worked kind of well. The Guyver suit is the least interesting of all of the makeup effects in this one, which kind of surprised me, but it still works, and it's still that kind of sleazy, grimy 1990s grindhouse kind of film. And if you're into that, and if you're in the mood for that, you might want to check it out. The third movie I got for you is from 2017-2018. It's based on an anime and manga by someone called Yukito Kishiro. It's directed by Robert Rodriguez. It was produced by James Cameron. It stars Rosa Salazar and Christoph Waltz. And it is Alita Battle Angel. Now, if you haven't seen this one, you really should. The world building in this is first rate. Now, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here, but I saw this on my new 4K setup in this 4K version, and it blew me away. It really did show me the possibilities of the new kind of setup. Now, it's set about 500 years in the future. There's been a fall of civilization about 300 years before this, and an enormous war between Earth and Mars, and Earth is left with one last city, which is grimy, and everybody who survived the holocausts that occurred 300 years ago has moved to this multicultural melting pot of a city, which has a really a kind of an elite area suspended above it and cabled to sit above the city. A doctor played by Christoph Waltz has a job of basically repairing cyborgs. A lot of people in the city have cybernetic enhancements. Some of them are purely therapeutic. Others are ways of making them more powerful, because the big sport in the city is a thing called motorball, which is kind of like cyborg rollerball, but with a lot more death in it. And the professor has a secret life as a bounty hunter who hunts down criminals and delivers them to the powers that be, who live in the city above the city. Now, whilst looking at the scrapyard of junk that falls down from the city above the city, the professor finds a robot head and torso with a human brain in it, which dates back 300 years. This human brain is still functioning because the technology 300 years before the movie is set is incredibly more advanced than it is in his city. And he takes it back and resurrects the cyborg and names her Alita after his dead daughter. He gives her a body that he created for his daughter. His daughter had a degenerative disease, and he was creating a cyborg body for her so she could live and function. And she becomes kind of a surrogate daughter to him. Now, Alita has some unusual abilities. It turns out that she's actually a resurrected berserker from the Martian invasion of 300 years before. She's a top-level cyborg soldier. That makes her very interesting to the powers that be, who are personified by Mahershala Ali, and who is himself controlled by a power above him, who lives in the city up at the top. A little bit complex. You've also got Christoph Waltz's ex-wife, played by Jennifer Connelly, who has made a deal with the devil to improve her life after her marriage broke down following the death of their daughter. And of course, I haven't mentioned that Rosa Salazar plays Alita with a lot of mocap and with somewhat bigger than human eyes, so she's got a slightly anime look, which for me somehow doesn't really dip into the uncanny valley. It's an interesting way of creating a character that isn't quite human, but unlike movies like The Polar Express, the character doesn't have that freaky, almost human look that falls into the uncanny valley. I like the world building in this one as well. You've got things like there's a bar where all of the bounty hunters hang out, and you get to see a whole bunch of different bounty hunters in that scene, including a really interesting one played by Jeff Fahey, who uses cybernetic dogs to help him with his bounty hunting. The world feels really lived in, and that's partly to do with Robert Rodriguez directing the movie. He grew up in Texas. He knew Texas Mexico border towns quite well. And of course he made El Mariachi and Desperado in Mexico, so he knows what that life of scrambling to make a living and doing whatever you need to do to help you and your family is about. And that inhabits this movie to a greater degree than I expected it to. It really does give you that kind of working poor feel about it in a lot of ways, and how the rich take advantage of that. There's a bit of class warfare and very much class awareness in this movie. Now, there are parts of it that to some people look a bit like computer games, but for me the world looks lived in, and even though it isn't perfect, there are things like there are long distance scenes where there's no haze in the distance, everything's very clear to the horizon, which is not the way the world really is. There are those little bits of business where maybe they could have tweaked that a little bit to fade into and fuzzy up the distances. But apart from that, it works really well. I think the characters have heart, which works well. Christoph Waltz is really good when he's playing a sympathetic character, as much as he's really good when he's playing a monstrous character. Rosa Salazar does a good job of acting through the mocap, the motion capture, and giving us a really interesting character. Jennifer Connelly's character is a little underwritten, but she does give it some depth and makes it an interesting character. And Mahershala Ali is never bad in anything, and he's quite good as the main villain in this. There's also a boyfriend called Hugo for Alita, and he has an interesting arc as a character, and he is one of the characters that demonstrates to us the lengths people will go to survive and to make a living in a very difficult environment. So the movie does have that going for it. It doesn't come from a place of comfort and privilege the way a lot of Hollywood movie making does. It's very much aware of poverty and that futuristic cyberpunky kind of post-cyberpunk, post-human world in some ways is really great. People just accept the fact that if something goes wrong, you're going to have parts of your body replaced by machinery. They've got past the trauma that we see a character like Steve Austin undergoing in the $6 Million Man pilot, to a point where you realise, yes, this is going to happen if something goes wrong, and I'll have to somehow function with that. And that's kind of the arc of this episode in a sense. We've gone from the exceptionalism and the exceptional breakthrough of Steve Austin to a world in Alita Battle Angel where cybernetic enhancement and cybernetic replacement is accepted and is so integral to the world. We don't think of it as exceptional any more than we think of somebody having a mobile phone in our day as being exceptional. And that works for me. I don't think it's a perfect movie, but I think it's a good, solid action film. I want to see a sequel if there is one in production, because I think that world has a lot more to give from it. And at a time when everybody is just concentrating on superheroes and concentrating on things that have previous intellectual properties that they can remake, reimagine, make sequels to, and the rest of it, this is a movie that, it came from anime and manga, mostly manga, but it's not a well-known property, and yet it gives us a beautifully rich and textured world. The world building is the secret sauce in this movie, and if you haven't seen it, or you haven't seen it for a couple of years, it might be worth revisiting with that awareness. It's a little bit it was fairly prominent, but I still think it's a hidden gem in some ways, in that the complexity of it is the hidden part that a re-watching may well give you. So that's it for this time around. Thank you very much for watching. I really enjoy cyborg movies. I enjoy science fiction in general, of course. But if you enjoyed the video, please consider liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment. You can also support the channel at patreon.com/paleocinema. I'm not going to tell you to look after yourselves, because you know this now. You know what you need to do. You know that we're kind of getting to the second half of the pandemic, but we've still got to take care of ourselves and others. Watch some great movies, watch some interesting movies, Watch some 1970s television pilots if you can find them, because they're usually a little more nuanced than the series that follow. And I'll catch you next time.